previous inquiry leaves us suspended at a threshold where explanation has not yet begun, where systems appear in operation before any narrative of origin is offered. It is from this quiet suspension that the earliest material evidence emerges, not in the form of stories, but in the form of marks. The first references to humans in the Sumerian record do not arrive as names, genealogies, or acts of divine intention. They arrive instead as impressions pressed into clay, arranged in columns, ordered without commentary. The earliest tablets from southern Mesopotamia are not historical in the later sense. They do not announce events, nor do they situate themselves within time as a story would. These proto-administrative tablets record quantities, commodities, and allocations, grain, livestock, labor units. Among these entries appear signs that scholars later understand as referring to people, but these signs are functional rather than descriptive. They denote recipients, workers, dependents, or rations assigned. The human presence is assumed, not introduced. What is striking in these earliest records is not what they say, but what they do not need to say. There is no hesitation, no explanatory preface, no indication that the category of human is new, fragile, or contested. The signs function as if their meaning were already stabilized before the tablet was ever pressed. A scribe did not pause to explain who these people were, where they came from, or why they were entitled to grain. The tablet proceeds as if such questions were irrelevant to its task. Lexical lists deepen this impression. These lists, often copied and recopied in scribal contexts, arrange words into ordered sequences. Professions, objects, animals, places. Humans appear within these lists as types and roles, rather than as beings with an origin. There are signs for workers, officials, dependents, and specialists. The structure of the lists suggests categorization rather than discovery. The human is treated as an element within an already ordered world, not as a recent addition to it. Chronologically, these tablets belong to a phase before extended mythological compositions are attested. They predate the narratives in which gods speak, decide, or create. This temporal ordering matters. The earliest written traces of human presence in Mesopotamia are embedded in systems of management. Writing itself emerges not to explain existence, but to regulate it. The act of recording presupposes continuity. Tomorrow's rations will resemble today's. The categories used now will remain intelligible later. From a historiographic perspective, this creates a subtle tension. Later texts will describe moments of creation, formation, or assignment of purpose to humanity. But the earliest tablets operate without reference to such moments. They neither anticipate them nor contradict them. They simply do not require them. Humans appear as counted units within an administrative landscape that seems already settled. Even the absence of personal names is instructive. Early tablets often refer to groups or roles rather than individuals. Where names do appear, they function as identifiers within transactions, not as bearers of narrative identity. There is no concern with lineage, biography, or uniqueness. The human is legible insofar as they participate in the flow of goods and labor. This mode of reference suggests a worldview in which existence is validated through function. The signs themselves reinforce this impression. Protocuneiform symbols for people are schematic, abstracted. They do not depict bodies in detail, nor do they gesture toward acts of creation. They are markers within a system, designed for speed and consistency rather than reflection. Their repeated use across tablets implies training, standardization, and shared understanding among scribes. Such understanding must have been inherited rather than invented anew with each inscription. This raises a methodological question. If the earliest written records already assume humans as operational entities, then any inquiry into origins must account for this assumption. The tablets do not present themselves as documenting a beginning. They document a continuation. The scribes who produce them appear unconcerned with how humanity came to be, focusing instead on how humanity is to be managed. Importantly, this is not a silence born of ignorance. The complexity of the administrative systems implies deliberate choice. Writing is being used selectively. What is recorded is what must be remembered to maintain order. What is omitted may have been considered stable, unproblematic, or outside the scope of administration. In this sense, the absence of creation language in early tablets may reflect not a lack of belief, but a lack of necessity. When later texts introduce explicit acts of creation involving divine figures, they do so within a world that has long been administratively mapped. The humans described in those narratives resemble the humans of the tablets: laborers, servants, dependents. This continuity suggests that the narratives may be responding to an already existing human category rather than defining it for the first time. From this angle, the question of whether humans were created twice shifts subtly. It becomes less about biological beginnings and more about moments of formal definition. The earliest tablets show humans present without explanation. Later texts offer explanations that may serve to reframe, justify, or reorganize that presence within a changing cosmic order. The historiographic challenge, then, is to read the earliest records on their own terms. They are not incomplete myths waiting to be filled in. They are complete documents with specific purposes. Their treatment of humans as already their entities suggests a conception of humanity as part of an inherited order, one that writing enters not to found, but to stabilize. If the first written traces of humanity appear without names, stories, or origins, functioning smoothly within systems of control and distribution, one is left to ask, when the texts later speak of creation, are they describing a beginning, or are they responding to something that, from the very start of writing, was never treated as needing one at all? If the earliest records did not feel compelled to explain where humans came from, the next layer of evidence suggests that what later texts call creation may have answered a different problem altogether. As administrative documentation expands, the language surrounding people becomes more formal, more constrained, and more precise. Humanity does not enter these records as a mystery to be solved, but as a category to be managed, allocated, and stabilized within an institutional framework. Russian tablets from the late 4th and early 3rd millennium presents humans almost exclusively in terms of entitlement and obligation. Grain, beer, oil, and textiles are distributed to individuals or groups designated by role. The tablet does not narrate who these people are. It specifies how much they receive and under what classification. The human subject is defined by position within an economic circuit. In this environment, to be recognized is to be counted, and to be counted is to be assigned a share. The terminology used for people in these records is revealing. Words translated as worker, dependent, or household member do not describe intrinsic qualities. They denote status within an administrative system. A person appears on the tablet not because of birth or origin, but because they occupy a recognized slot within the apparatus of production and distribution. This suggests that existence, in bureaucratic terms, is conferred through registration. Labor assignment texts reinforce this logic. Groups are listed alongside tasks, durations, and supervisors. The tablet constructs a world in which humans are units of effort, measurable and transferable. There is no sense that this arrangement is provisional or newly established. The language implies continuity, as though such assignments have always been the proper way to organize people. Creation, in this context, looks less like a moment in time and more like an act of formal inclusion. Later, literary compositions will speak of humans being made for work, fashioned to relieve divine burdens. Yet the administrative texts already operate as if this principle were self. The ration system presumes that labor and sustenance are linked, that people exist within an economy of obligation. The making of humans described elsewhere may therefore reflect not a biological act, but an official articulation of a role that administration had long enforced. The scribes who produced these tablets were not theologians. Their concern was accuracy, accountability, and continuity. When a tablet records a delivery of barley to a group of workers, it assumes a shared understanding of who qualifies as a worker and why they are entitled to rations. This shared understanding does not require explanation because it is embedded in practice. The act of writing reinforces it. In some myth texts, shifts in terminology suggests moments of reclassification. New labels appear, old ones fade, and categories are reorganized. Such changes coincide with broader administrative reforms, not with narrative declarations of creation. This pattern implies that what changes is not humanity itself, but the way humanity is defined within the system. Creation becomes a matter of designation, assigning a group to a function, recognizing a population as subject to a particular set of rules. The Anunnaki entered these administrative worlds indirectly. They are recipients of offerings, names invoked in institutional contexts, overseers of temples, that function as economic centers. When later texts attribute the creation of humans to these figures, the language aligns closely with administrative concerns. Humans are created to serve, to work, to maintain order. The divine act mirrors bureaucratic logic. Creation is framed as the establishment of a workforce. This framing raises an important implication. If creation language reflects the needs of administration, then it may emerge at moments when systems require justification or reassertion. A declaration that humans were created for labor could serve to naturalize existing arrangements, presenting them as primordial rather than contingent. In this sense, creation is less about origins and more about authorization. The tablets themselves do not argue this point. They do not need to. Their authority lies in routine. Day after day, rations are issued, labor is assigned, accounts are balanced. The system perpetuates itself through repetition. Writing becomes a memory device, ensuring that roles persist across time. Humanity, as recorded here, is a stable component of that memory. What is absent from these records is as telling as what is present. There is no moment where humans suddenly appear in the accounts. There is no first entry marking the introduction of people into the system. The administrative world assumes their presence from its earliest surviving traces. When later texts speak of creation, they do so within a world already saturated with human activity. This suggests a reframing of the central question. If humans are administratively present before they are narratively created, then creation may represent a secondary act, a formal definition imposed upon an existing category. The act of making humans could be understood as an act of naming, classifying, and binding them to institutional purpose. As administrative language grows more elaborate, so too does the distance between biological existence and recorded existence. To be human in the eyes of the tablet is to be legible to the system. Creation, in this sense, is the moment when legibility is granted or renewed. It is an event of recognition rather than emergence. If this is how the records function, then one must ask quietly, without forcing an answer. When the texts speak of humans being created, are they recalling a beginning, or are they documenting the moment when humanity was formally entered, perhaps entered again, into the ledgers of an enduring order? If creation can be understood as an act of recognition within records, then the language used to describe such acts becomes unusually important. The tablets do not merely record actions, they preserve choices about verbs, about what kinds of actions were considered meaningful enough to name. Over time, these choices shift. The changes are subtle, but they leave traces that suggest more than one way of understanding what it meant to bring humans into order. Early Sumerian and Akkadian texts rely on a limited set of verbs to describe acts of making. These verbs do not begin as philosophical terms. They emerge from craft, construction, and repair. A verb used for shaping clay vessels appears alongside one used for erecting walls or assembling tools. When these same verbs later describe the formation of people, they carry with them the practical weight of their earlier uses. Creation, in linguistic terms, is grounded in manufacture rather than genesis. Across periods, one encounters verbs that can mean to build, to establish, or to set in place. When applied to cities, temples, or offices, these verbs imply organization rather than invention. A city is not imagined as arising from nothing. It is laid out to restored, or when similar language is applied to humans, the implication is consistent. The act described is one of arrangement within an existing framework. Some texts introduce verbs that suggest renewal rather than origin. These are the same words used for repairing walls after damage, or re-establishing cult practices after interruption. When applied to people, such verbs imply continuity across disruption. Humanity is not newly imagined, but adjusted, redefined, or returned to a proper state. The language treats human existence as something that can lapse and be corrected. Over time, the range of verbs expands. Later compositions distinguish between forming, assigning, and naming. Naming, in particular, carries administrative significance. To name is to classify, to render something legible within a system of records. When humans are said to be named or designated, the action aligns closely with bureaucratic practice. A named entity can be counted, taxed, or assigned duties. The linguistic shift suggests a growing concern with formal definition. Semantic drift becomes visible when the same verb appears in different contexts across centuries. A word that once referred primarily to physical construction gradually acquires abstract uses. This process does not erase earlier meanings. Eat, layer stem. When such a verb is used in a text describing human formation, it resonates with its older senses. The human is implicitly treated as something assembled, maintained, or repaired, not spontaneously generated. The scribes responsible for preserving these texts were trained in lexical tradition. They copied lists of words precisely because meanings mattered. Changes in verb usage were not accidental. They reflect evolving conventions within scribal schools, shaped by administrative needs and institutional memory. When a scribe chose one verb over another to describe a divine act, that choice aligned with inherited understandings of action and responsibility. Notably, the language rarely isolates a single, definitive act of making. Instead, verbs cluster. Formation is followed by assignment. Establishment is followed by regulation. This sequencing implies process rather than moment. Humanity appears as something shaped over stages, each stage described by a different action word. The absence of a single, unambiguous creation verb suggests that no single moment was linguistically privileged as the beginning. In some cases, the same text uses different verbs for humans in different contexts. A passage may describe humans as formed in one line and organized in another. The shift does not appear contradictory. It reflects a worldview in which existence and function are separable. One can exist without being properly arranged, and arrangement may require its own act of making. When divine figures are associated with these verbs, their role aligns with oversight rather than craftsmanship. They authorize, assign, or restore. The language positions them as administrators of order rather than inventors of substance. Even when a verb implies shaping, it does so within limits, as if the material already exists and only needs proper configuration. This linguistic pattern complicates any straightforward reading of creation narratives. If the verbs themselves carry histories of use that emphasize restoration and classification, then their application to humans may signal moments of redefinition rather than absolute beginnings. The language does not insist on novelty. It accommodates repetition. The possibility of multiple acts of making emerges, not through explicit declaration, but through accumulation. Different verbs, used at different times, describe different relationships between humans and order. One text emphasizes formation, another assignment, another restoration. Taken together, they imply that humanity could be treated as something made more than once, each time in a different sense. The scribes who preserved these verbs did not explain their choices. They relied on shared understanding. Their audience knew what these words meant in practice. For them, the distinction between making and remaking was not philosophical. It was operational. A wall rebuilt after collapse was still the same wall, yet it required a verb of making. A cult restored after neglect was not new, yet it too was said to be made again. If this is the linguistic environment in which humans are said to be created, then the question shifts once more. When the texts speak of making humanity, are they referring to an origin in time, or to one of several moments when humans were linguistically and administratively reshaped to fit a renewed order? If so, how many such moments did the language quietly allow? If the language of making allows for repetition without rupture, the records themselves invite a further step backward, toward a time when even divine agency is not yet foregrounded. In the earliest documents that speak of order, authority, and continuity, humans appear not as creations of named gods, but as participants in systems that already function. The gods, at least as explicit actors, arrive later. Early king lists provide a restrained but revealing perspective. These texts do not begin with acts of creation. They begin with rule. Kingship is said to have descended, to have been established in specific cities, and to have moved when circumstances required. The language presumes a population capable of being ruled. Kings are listed with reign lengths measured in years, sometimes impossibly long, but the unit of measurement itself assumes an already existing human framework. Time is counted because there are people to count it. In these lists, the divine world remains largely in the background. Gods are not described as fashioning humans or explaining their purpose. Instead, they function as guarantors of kingship's legitimacy. Authority is anchored above, but humanity is treated as a constant below. The text does not pause to explain how humans came to be subjects of rule. Their presence is implicit, unproblematic, and stable. Offering texts reinforce this impression. Some of the earliest offerings recorded are not accompanied by extended theological explanation. They list quantities of food, drink, or animals presented at specific locations. The recipient may be a temple or an institution rather than a named deity. In some cases, divine names appear later as these practices become more formalized. The act of offering precedes the elaboration of divine narrative. This sequence matters. If offerings are made before gods are fully specified, then ritual practice may have been institutional before it was made. Humans are shown performing regulated actions, bringing goods, observing schedules, maintaining spaces without explicit reference to why these actions originated. The record treats the practice as inherited, not invented. Even when gods are named, their role is often administrative rather than creative. They receive offerings, oversee temples, and legitimize authority. The texts do not yet frame them as architects of humanity. Instead, they appear as senior partners in an already functioning system. Humans are not introduced as products of divine labor. They are present as caretakers, workers, and participants. The contrast between record-keeping and later mythological composition is striking. Mythological texts often explain why humans exist and what they owe the gods. Administrative records simply assume those obligations. From the perspective of the scribe, the obligation does not need explanation. It needs accounting. The reason why grain is offered is less important than ensuring that it is offered correctly and recorded accurately. This suggests that the relationship between humans and gods was experienced first as a practical arrangement rather than a narrated origin. Humans appear in the records performing duties that later myths will justify. The justification comes after the fact, framing established practices within a broader cosmological story. In this sense, divine credits may be retrospective. The Anunnaki, when they appear more clearly in later texts, are integrated into this retrospective framework. They are positioned as decision-makers who sanction the order already visible in the records. Their association with human creation aligns with their role as administrators of cosmic balance. Yet the earliest records do not require their presence to function. Humanity is already there, already organized, already accountable. This does not mean that early scribes denied divine involvement. Rather, it suggests that divine involvement was not always articulated. The absence of explicit attribution may reflect a stage when explanation was unnecessary. Systems at work do not demand origins. Only when systems are questioned, disrupted, or reinterpreted does the need for narrative emerge. The gradual appearance of gods taking credit for human existence coincides with periods of textual elaboration. As writing expands beyond accounting into reflection, the relationship between humans and the divine is articulated more fully. Creation narratives begin to explain what the tablets had long assumed. Humans are said to have been made for service, for labor, for maintenance of order roles they were already performing. From a historiographic standpoint, this sequence suggests a layering of meaning. The administrative layer comes first, establishing practice. The mythological layer follows, providing rationale. Humans do not wait to be created before they act. They are acted upon by narrative after their actions have been normalized. This raises a quiet, but persistent question. If humans appear in the records before the gods explicitly claim responsibility, for them does the language of creation describe an origin, or does it mark the moment when existing human roles were formally attributed to divine intent, perhaps for the first time, or perhaps once again? If divine credit can arrive after practice is already in place, then the moment when the Anunnaki begin to occupy the center of the record becomes especially revealing. Their entrance is not abrupt, nor is it announced as a new discovery. It unfolds gradually, through changes in emphasis, placement, and responsibility within texts that were already concerned with order. In the earliest administrative and institutional documents, divine names appear sparingly and without hierarchy. A god may be listed as the recipient of an offering or as the name attached to a temple estate, but there is little sense of an organized divine assembly. The records function without requiring a structured pantheon. Authority is implied, not narrated. Over time, however, certain divine names began to recur with greater frequency and in more elevated contexts. It is within this shift that the Anunnaki become visible as a collective rather than as isolated figures. Their appearance coincides with texts that are no longer satisfied with recording outcomes alone. As compositions expand to address legitimacy, cosmic order, and responsibility, the need for a governing group of divine actors becomes more pronounced. The Anunnaki fill this role not as creators in the biological sense, but as administrators of a larger system. References to divine hierarchy sharpen. Gods are no longer interchangeable recipients of offerings. They are ranked, assigned domains, and grouped into councils. The Anunnaki are named as those who decide, decree, and authorize. Their authority is expressed through verbs of command and assignment rather than through acts of manual creation. They function as a deliberative body, echoing the assemblies of elders or officials familiar from human governance. This mirroring is not accidental. The scribes who shaped these texts lived within bureaucratic institutions. When they described divine order, they did so using the language of administration they knew best. The Anunnaki preside over destinies, assign roles, and maintain balance. Their authority legitimizes existing structures by projecting them onto a cosmic scale. As the Anunnaki become central, the focus of texts shifts from recording practice to explaining why practice exists. Humans, already embedded in systems of labor and obligation, are now situated within a narrative framework that assigns purpose to those systems. The Anunnaki are credited with decisions that make sense of the world as it is recorded. Their role is explanatory rather than observational. Importantly, this narrative development does not replace earlier records. It overlays them. Administrative tablets continue to be produced alongside mythological compositions. The two genres coexist, addressing different needs. Where the tablet ensures continuity, the narrative ensures meaning. The Anunnaki operate primarily in the latter, providing a rationale that administration alone does not articulate. The timing of their prominence suggests response rather than initiation. As cities grow, hierarchies solidify, and crises interrupt stability. The need to ground authority beyond human institutions intensifies. The Anunnaki offer that grounding. They are portrayed as having always been present, yet their textual prominence is clearly historical, emerging when explanation becomes necessary. Within this framework, human creation narratives take on a particular character. When the Anunnaki are said to have participated in making humans, the act aligns with their established function as organizers. Creation is described in terms that resonate with governance, deciding roles, setting limits, assigning burdens. Humanity is positioned as part of an ordered system sanctioned by a divine council. This does not negate earlier silence. Rather, it reframes it. The absence of the Anunnaki in the earliest records does not imply their non-existence, but their irrelevance to the task at hand. Only when texts turn toward justification does their presence become indispensable. The Anunnaki enter the record as answers to questions that administration alone could not address. From the perspective of mythological development, this suggests that divine hierarchy evolves in dialogue with human institutions. The Anunnaki reflect the needs of the societies that invoked them. Their authorities stabilize as memory, presenting the current order as the outcome of deliberate, ancient decisions. Yet this raises an unresolved implication. If the Anunnaki become central, precisely when explanation is required, then their role in human creation may correspond to a moment of redefinition rather than an initial beginning. They explain why humans serve, labor, and obey, but those activities predate the explanation. As the record begins to attribute these roles to divine decision, one is left to wonder quietly, are the Anunnaki being introduced to describe how humans first came into being, or to formalize, perhaps, more than once the terms under which humans were already living? If the Anunnaki enter the record as a response to the need for explanation, then the flood occupies a different position altogether. It is not introduced as a story that clarifies origins, but as a line that divides how records speak. On one side of that line, continuity is assumed. On the other, continuity must be managed. Archaeologically, the flood appears not as a single, universal layer, but as a series of regional interruptions. Thick bands of silt, unevenly distributed, mark moments when water displaced habitation. These layers do not erase everything beneath them. Walls remain truncated but visible, floors sealed rather than destroyed. Above them, rebuilding occurs with familiar materials and methods. The ground shifts, but the logic of settlement resumes with little hesitation. From the perspective of stratigraphy, this matters. Flood layers function as separators in the soil, but not as foundations for entirely new worlds. They interrupt, but they do not reset. The same can be said of the texts that later speak of the flood. They do not linger on destruction. They mark a before and an after, then proceed. In the written record, the flood operates as a boundary of accounting. King lists divide themselves cleanly. Reigns before the flood, reigns after. The phrasing is formulaic, almost bureaucratic. Kingship is said to have existed, then to have been interrupted. Tend to RB been lowered again. The verb choice is careful. Kingship is not invented anew. It is restored to the human sphere, as if held elsewhere in the interim. This formulation implies that certain structures are portable across catastrophe. Kingship can be removed and returned. Time can be segmented and resumed. The flood becomes a hinge rather than an ending. Humanity, notably, is not reintroduced. There is no statement that humans were recreated after the waters receded. They are simply present again, participating in renewed institutions. Administrative texts, after flood layers, reinforce this impression. The earliest post-flood tablets resume familiar practices. Recording rations, labor, and offerings. The handwriting evolves. The formats adjust, but the underlying assumptions remain. People are counted. Goods are distributed. Temples receive provisions. The system continues, aware of interruption but not defined by it. This continuity suggests that the flood was treated as an event that affected space rather than category. Cities may be rebuilt, offices reassigned, lineages reestablished, but the definition of humanity does not appear to require revision. The records do not frame the post-flood population as fundamentally different. They inherit roles rather than receive them anew. The silence here is structural. If the flood had required a redefinition of what it meant to be human, one would expect that redefinition to appear somewhere in the administrative record. Instead, what changes is emphasis. Texts become more attentive to legitimacy, lineage, and divine sanction. The flood introduces the need to explain continuity, not to recreate it. In later compositions, the flood acquires narrative weight. It becomes a moment of divine judgment or decision. Yet even in these texts, the outcome is not the creation of a new humanity, but the preservation of a remnant. Survival, not replacement, is the operative theme. Humanity passes through the flood, altered in circumstance, not in category. From an archaeological angle, this aligns with the material evidence. There is disruption, but also resumption. The tools used after the flood resembled those used before. Building techniques persist. Measurement systems reappear. The physical culture suggests inheritance rather than invention. Memory is carried forward, even when the ground itself has been rearranged. The flood thus functions as a textual boundary that demands narrative explanation without demanding ontological change. It divides time into eras, but it does not redefine the human subject that moves between them. When later texts speak of renewed order after the flood, they do so using verbs associated with restoration and placement, not with creation from nothing. This raises a subtle implication for the question of multiple creations. If the flood marks a clear dividing line in texts and strata, yet does not coincide with an explicit recreation of humanity, then any notion of humans being made again must operate within narrower terms. It would have to be administrative, linguistic, or legal rather than biological or existential. The flood teaches the scribes how to think about rupture. It provides a model for interruption without erasure. Systems can fail and be resumed. Authority can be withdrawn and returned, but the category of human remains stable enough to carry these processes across the divide. As the records move forward from this boundary, they begin to scrutinize continuity more closely. Questions of sameness and difference grow sharper. If humans persist through the flood without being remade, then where, if anywhere, does the record allow for a moment when humanity itself is redefined rather than merely carried forward? If the flood establishes a boundary without redefining humanity, then the documents that follow it invite closer inspection. They do not announce a new beginning. They resume. The earliest post-flood economic and census tablets speak in a familiar administrative voice, one that appears to recognize its own past, even as it records a renewed present. These tablets register households, labor groups, livestock, and grain stores with a precision that suggests inherited routines. The formats vary slightly. The signs show incremental standardization, but the underlying grammar of administration remains intact. Humans are still counted in units, still assigned roles, still embedded in systems of obligation. The language does not pause to clarify who these people are. It proceeds as if their status were already understood. Census-style documents are particularly revealing. They enumerate populations attached to estates or institutions, distinguishing by age, capacity, or function. The criteria used for classification echo earlier practices. A person is legible insofar as they fit into a category that administration recognizes. There is no indication that these categories had to be reinvented after the flood. They appear to have been waiting. Economic texts reinforce this continuity. Rations are distributed according to established norms. The ratios of grain or beer to labor units resemble pre-flood patterns. Even when shortages or adjustments are recorded, the logic of compensation remains stable. The system assumes that human needs and obligations are known quantities, not variables introduced by catastrophe. What is absent from these post-flood records is any language of There is no suggestion that humans are now different, improved, diminished, or newly authorized. The tablets do not describe a fresh social contract. They record a return to work. This return is treated as expected, almost inevitable, as though the interruption were temporary and external to the system itself. The scribes responsible for these records seem to operate with confidence in their categories. They do not annotate changes in terminology or explain why certain groups are counted in specific ways. Their task is not to narrate recovery, but to ensure continuity. Writing serves as a bridge across the disruption, preserving administrative memory. Subtle shifts do occur, but they are incremental rather than foundational. Some texts show increased attention to lineage or household structure, perhaps reflecting a need to reassert claims after displacement. Others refine measures or clarify titles. These changes suggest adaptation, not reinvention. The human subject remains administratively stable, even as circumstances require adjustment. This stability carries implications for how post-flood humanity was understood. If humans had been newly created or fundamentally altered, the administration would have needed to account for that change. New categories would have been required. New rules would have been articulated. Instead, the tablets imply that the same conceptual framework sufficed. Even references to divine oversight do not alter this picture. Gods continue to receive offerings and sanction institutions, but the human side of the ledger remains consistent. The divine may have acted to preserve or restore order, but the order itself relies on a human population already defined. The texts do not depict a renegotiation of what it means to be human. They depict the resumption of management. This continuity suggests that the flood, while disruptive, did not function as a moment of anthropological reset in the eyes of administrators. Humanities passes through the boundary intact in its recorded form. The same verbs describe labor, the same signs denote people, the same assumptions underpin the accounts. Yet this raises a question of emphasis rather than presence. While humans are treated as the same administratively, the increased attention to authority and legitimacy in post-flood texts hints at a subtle shift in how order is justified. The records become more careful about who rules and why. Humanity is stable, but kingship requires This distinction matters. If humans are assumed to persist unchanged, but authority must be restored, then the flood affects governance more than population. The administrative language reflects this priority. It invests effort in tracking resources and people, but it leaves the definition of humanity untouched. From a comparative textual perspective, the sameness of language across the flood boundary suggests that any notion of humans being created again would not be visible at this level. The tablets do not register such an event. They register continuity. If a second creation is implied anywhere, it must operate in a different register, perhaps one concerned with legitimacy rather than any. As the post-flood records settle into routine, they prepare the ground for a renewed articulation of authority. Humans are present, accounted for, and organized. What remains to be explained is not who they are, but who has the right to rule them and whether that right, like kingship itself, had to be established once more after the waters receded. If the post-flood records assume humanity without hesitation, they nevertheless hesitate when speaking of authority. Kingship does not simply continue, it is said to return. The language surrounding this return is careful, formal, and repeated often enough to suggest that it carried particular weight for those who recorded it. In the king lists, the flood divides not only time, but legitimacy. Before the waters, kings rule for vast spans, their reigns stretching beyond ordinary measurement. After the flood, reigns become shorter. Cities change and succession appears more regular. Between these two sections stands a formula that is both brief and dense. Kingship was lowered again from heaven. The phrase does not describe an invention, but a reinstatement. Something known has been placed back where it belongs. What is striking is what this formula does not accompany. There is no parallel statement about humanity being restored or recreated. The text does not say that people were made again, gathered again, or assigned again. The assumption is that humans were present and capable of receiving kingship as soon as it returned. Authority required reauthorization. Population did not. This asymmetry reveals how political theology operated in the Sumerian record. Kingship is treated as a conditional institution. It can be withdrawn, suspended, and reestablished. Its legitimacy must be renewed through divine sanction. Humanity, by contrast, is treated as a constant. It does not require re-legitimation. It endures across rupture without formal acknowledgement. The legitimacy formulas attached to early post-flood kings reinforce this distinction. Kings are described as chosen, approved, or beloved by specific gods. Their right to rule is narrated carefully. Cities are named as seats of authority, and the movement of kingship from one city to another is recorded as a meaningful event. These formulas situate power within a framework that demands explanation. Humans, however, remain unnamed in this process. They are the recipients of rule, not its subject. The texts do not describe them as accepting kingship or being reconstituted as a polity. Their role is implied. They exist as the background against which authority operates. This background does not need narration because it is stable. From the perspective of political theology, this suggests that kingship is an overlay on an already existing social fabric. It is a structure imposed upon humanity, not something that brings humanity into being. The act of lowering kingship from heaven formalizes a relationship between gods and rulers, not between gods and people as such. The Anunnaki, when they appear in these contexts, function as guarantors of this arrangement. They're associated with decisions about kingship, with the allocation of power, and with the maintenance of cosmic order. Their involvement underscores the seriousness of authority, not the existence of humanity. Creation language, when it appears elsewhere, serves a different function. This distinction becomes clearer when one considers the narrative economy of the texts. Space is devoted to explaining why one king ruled and another followed. Attention is paid to the transfer of kingship between cities. Yet no space is devoted to explaining why humans are there to be ruled. Their presence is taken for granted. Such treatment implies a conceptual hierarchy. Humanity is foundational. Kingship is contingent. The flood disrupts the contingent layer, requiring divine action to restore it. The foundational layer persists without comment. The scribes who compiled these lists appear comfortable with this arrangement. They did not feel compelled to articulate what they did not see as threatened. This has implications for how one understands creation narratives. If humanity were thought to be fragile or episodic, one would expect its restoration to be narrated alongside that of kingship. The absence of such narration suggests that humanity was perceived as continuous, even inevitable. It survives catastrophe without formal renewal. Yet the very need to state that kingship was lowered again hints at anxiety about order. Authority must be justified repeatedly. Perhaps this anxiety also shaped later narratives about human purpose and origin. If kingship requires divine explanation after disruption, might humanity itself require renewed explanation in other contexts, even if not after the flood? The king lists thus position humanity and authority differently in relation to rupture. One endures silently, the other demands proclamation. As the texts move forward, they begin to explore the terms of this relationship more explicitly, asking not whether humans exist, but under what conditions they serve. If kingship must be restored while humanity is assumed, then one is left to consider a final implication. When creation is spoken of elsewhere in the record, is it humanity that is being brought in to be Enor? Is it the political and social order that governs them being re-established in language, perhaps more than once? If authority required careful articulation while humanity itself did not, Then the way bodies are treated in the record becomes another quiet point of tension. Humans are present everywhere in the text as workers, subjects, patients, recipients of Karyat. When creation is discussed, the body itself recedes almost entirely from view. What remains is a human without anatomy. Medical and healing texts preserve some of the most detailed descriptions of the human body in the Mesopotamian archive. They enumerate symptoms, pains, swellings, discharges, and dysfunctions with striking specificity. Organs are named. Limbs are differentiated. Internal processes are inferred through observation and treatment. These texts demonstrate that scribes and practitioners were capable of close bodily attention when their purpose required it. Yet this precision does not cross into creation narratives. When humans are said to be made, formed, or assigned, the texts do not describe bones, muscles, blood, or breath in any systematic way. There is no anatomical sequence, no concern with how a body comes together. The act of creation is linguistically thin, focused on role rather than substance. This contrast is revealing. The absence of biology is not due to ignorance. The same culture that could diagnose illness and prescribe treatment chose not to describe the physical formation of humans when discussing their origins. The omission appears intentional, or at least consistent. Creation is not framed as a physiological process. Instead, origin texts emphasize function. Humans are associated with work, service, maintenance, and obligation. The body is implied only insofar as it enables these tasks. A human is something that labors, suffers, or receives rations, not something whose internal structure needs explanation. The texts treat the body as given, not as a subject of origin. Even when clay or other materials are mentioned in relation to human formation, the reference remains symbolic rather than anatomical. Clay is shaped, but the shaping is not described in bodily terms. The image aligns more closely with craft metaphors than with biological development. The concern is with form as suitability, not with flesh as composition. Healing texts underscore this distinction further. They approach the body as a site of disruption that must be corrected. Disease represents a departure from order. Treatment aims to restore balance. The language used is one of repair rather than creation. A body is not remade when healed. It is returned to a proper state. This logic mirrors the verbs used elsewhere for restoration after damage. If the body is understood as something that can fall out of order and be restored, then its origin becomes less significant than its maintenance. The records reflect this priority. They invest energy in preserving functionality, not in explaining beginnings. The body is managed, not narrated. This management perspective aligns with administrative logic. A laboring body is valuable insofar as it performs tasks. Its internal structure matters only when it fails. Creation narratives, shaped by this environment, focus on the assignment of purpose rather than on physical assembly. The human is defined by what it does, not by what it is made of. Anunnaki, when associated with human creation, are similarly distant from biological detail. They decide, decree, or authorize. They do not operate as healers or craftsmen of flesh. Their role aligns with governance. The body remains outside their direct concern, entering the record primarily through illness or injury, not through origin. This division of textual labor suggests that different kinds of knowledge were kept distinct. Medical texts address the body as a technical problem. Origin texts address humanity as a structural component of order. The two domains rarely intersect. Where it is through metaphors of balance and disruption, not through shared descriptions of anatomy. The silence of biology in creation narratives, therefore, does not indicate a lack of interest in the body. It indicates a different conception of what creation meant. To be created was not to be physically assembled, but to be positioned within a system of obligations and care. The body, already present and understood, did not need to be explained again. This raises a subtle implication. If creation language avoids the body even when the body is well known elsewhere in the archive, then creation may not refer to the coming into being of flesh at all. It may refer to the moment when an already embodied human is formally recognized, assigned, or bound to a role. As the texts continue to speak of humans without describing their bodies, one is left with a quiet uncertainty. If creation does not explain how humans came to have bodies, then what exactly was being created, and could that act have occurred more than once without ever needing to touch the biology beneath it? If bodies could remain undescribed because their function was already understood, then the spaces built for those bodies offer another form of evidence. Architecture does not explain itself. It assumes the temples, platforms, and storage complexes of early Mesopotamia rise from the ground as if a labor force were already waiting for instruction. Temple construction records do not begin with the gathering of people. They begin with materials, brick counts, timber deliveries, bitumen allocations. The tablets record how much is needed and when it must arrive. Labor appears within these accounts as a resource already integrated into the process. Workers are assigned, rotated, and sustained through rations. The existence of a workforce is not negotiated. It is operational. These records suggest a planning mentality that presumes continuity. A temple is not conceived as an experiment. It is a scheduled project within an established system of work. The administrative language treats labor as dependable, predictable, and divisible. People can be assigned to tasks. In the same way materials are allocated. This presupposes a population already organized for collective effort. The architecture itself reinforces this assumption. Large-scale temple complexes require sustained labor over extended periods. Foundations must be laid, walls raised, terraces leveled. Such projects cannot rely on spontaneous or temporary participation. They demand coordination across seasons and years. The builders who planned these structures did so with confidence that labor would be available when required. Nowhere in the construction records is there an attempt to explain where this labor force came from. There is no account of its origin, no justification for its existence. The tablets concern themselves with efficiency, not explanation. They record absences, delays, shortages, but not beginnings. Labor is treated as part of the environment, like clay deposits or water access. This treatment aligns with broader labor organization systems. Workers are grouped, supervised, and compensated according to established norms. Titles appear for foremen and overseers, indicating layers of management. Such hierarchy implies long-standing practice. One does not invent labor organization at the same moment as undertaking monumental construction. The organization must precede the project. Temples themselves function as administrative centers. They store goods, distribute rations, and coordinate labor. Their architectural design reflects this dual role. Storage rooms, courtyards, and work areas are integrated into the sacred complex. The boundary between religious and economic space is porous. The temple does not merely receive offerings, it manages production. In this environment, explanations of human origin are unnecessary. What matters is reliability. The system depends on people showing up, performing tasks, and receiving sustenance. Writing ensures this reliability by recording obligations and entitlements. Architecture materializes it by shaping space around expected human movement and effort. Later texts may describe humans as created to serve the gods, to build and maintain temples. Yet the construction record suggests that such service was already routine before it was narrated. The built environment assumes compliance. It does not persuade, it organizes. Walls and platforms do not argue for labor. They require it. The scale of construction also implies generational continuity. A temple is repaired, expanded, rebuilt. Construction records span decades. This temporal depth suggests that labor was not a transient solution but a stable condition. The workforce persists across projects, adapting to new demands without requiring redefinition. The Anunnaki, when invoked in relation to temples, appear as owners or patrons rather than architects of labor itself. Temples are said to belong to them, to house their presence, but the mechanics of construction remain human and administrative. Divine association sanctifies the structure, not the workforce. The people who build are assumed, not created anew for the task. This separation mirrors earlier patterns. Creation language explains purpose after practice is established. Architecture, like administration, moves ahead without waiting for narrative justification. It embodies memory. Each brick laid follows a technique learned before, a rhythm repeated across generations. The knowledge required to build is inherited, not invented with each project. The silence of explanation within construction records is therefore not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which humanity is a given condition. The question is not whether people exist, but how they are organized. The built environment answers that question spatially, through design that channels labor into predictable forms. If temples rise on the assumption of a ready-made workforce, and if that workforce is never introduced or explained in the records that coordinate it, then the architecture itself becomes a kind of testimony. It speaks of humans as constants within the system, present before the first brick is counted. This leaves an unresolved implication. If the structures built for labor never acknowledge a beginning for the laborers themselves, then where, if anywhere, does the record expect that beginning to be located and? Is it possible that what later texts call creation was never meant to explain architecture-esque workforce at all, but something more abstract that buildings alone could not express? If architecture assumes labor without explanation, then the numbers used to organize that labor reveal an even deeper layer of continuity. Measurement does not tolerate ambiguity. It requires agreement, repetition, and trust that a unit today will mean the same thing tomorrow. Across the flood boundary, this trust appears to remain intact. Accounting tablets before the flood already display a sophisticated numerical order. Quantities of grain, livestock, and labor are recorded using standardized units. Measures of capacity, weight, and time recur with consistent internal logic. These systems are not exploratory. They function as if long established, relying on shared understanding between scribe, institution, and recipient. After the flood, these same systems reappear. The signs evolve, the scripts refine, but the underlying metrological framework persists. Units of measure retain their relative values. Ratios used to calculate rations or yields remain recognizable. The mathematics of administration resumes without recalibration. This continuity suggests that the disruption affected settlements, not systems. From a systems perspective, this is significant. Measurement is a form of memory. It encodes decisions made in the past about how to divide, compare, and allocate resources. For such a system to survive catastrophe, it must be carried by people who remember not only the units themselves, but the logic behind them. The flood does not interrupt this memory. Post-flood accounting tablets do not introduce new standards or explain old ones. They proceed as if the units are self-evident. A capacity sign means what it always meant. A numerical notation functions as expected. The scribes do not annotate changes or justify continuity. The mathematics speaks quietly of inheritance. This persistence extends to abstract numerical structures. The sexagesimal system, with its divisions and multiples, continues to shape calculations. Its use implies training and tradition. One does not invent such a system casually, nor does one resume it accidentally after interruption. Its survival suggests deliberate preservation. The relationship between numbers and people is implicit but stable. Labor is quantified in familiar ways. Workdays are counted, rations calculated, outputs compared. Humans are embedded within these numerical frameworks as variables that behave predictably. The system assumes that human effort can be measured in the same way before and after catastrophe. There is no sense that humanity required recalibration. If the flood had altered the nature of human labor, the accounting would have reflected it. New ratios would have been needed, new expectations encoded. Instead, the numbers imply sameness. The system continues to treat people as commensurable with their earlier counterparts. This numerical continuity reinforces the idea that the flood was processed as an event affecting conditions, not definitions. Crops may fail, stores may deplete, but the methods used to record these changes remain unchanged. The mathematics absorbs disruption without redefining its inputs. The Anunnaki, when associated with order and destiny, are linked to the fixing of measures and decrees. Yet the tablets themselves do not dramatize this role. They enact Italiano. By continuing to use the same numbers, the scribes affirm that order persists. The divine sanction of measure is implied through use, not narrative. In this sense, mathematics functions as a quiet counterpoint to myth, where stories explain, numbers assume. They do not tell us why things are so. They show us that things are treated as if they have always been so. The continuation of measurement across catastrophe suggests that whatever humans are, they remain compatible with the same systems of calculation. This compatibility matters for the broader question of creation. If humans had been fundamentally remade after the flood, one might expect the systems that measure their labor and consumption to shift accordingly. But the numbers do not signal such a shift. They continue to operate on the assumption of equivalence. The flood, then, tests the resilience of abstraction. Buildings may fall, cities may move, rulers may change, but numbers persist. They bind past and present into a single operational horizon. Humanity moves within that horizon without apparent alteration. As accounting tablets accumulate across eras, they form a silent argument, whatever narratives later texts provide. The mathematics of administration treats humanity as continuous. The units that measure work, food, and time do not distinguish between before and after. They record difference in quantity, not in kind. This leaves a final, restrained uncertainty. If numbers continue because the humans they measure are assumed to be the same, then where in the record could a second making of humanity be registered at all, and would a system built on continuity ever allow such a moment to be counted? If numbers continue without hesitation, law continues with even greater confidence. Legal texts do not measure, they bind. They presuppose a subject capable of obligation, responsibility, and consequence. In the earliest Mesopotamian legal formulations, that subject is never introduced. Early law codes and legal precedents emerge not as speculative philosophy, but as extensions of administration. They regulate theft, injury, debt, marriage, and labor. The language is precise, conditional, and procedural. If an act occurs, then a consequence follows. Nowhere in this structure is there a concern with defining who counts as human. The law addresses those already recognized. The stability of the legal subject is striking. A person can own property, incur debt, cause harm, or suffer penalty. These capacities are treated as self-evident. The texts do not explain why humans possess them, nor do they trace them back to an act of creation. Legal responsibility appears as an inherited condition, not a granted one, even when social distinctions are carefully marked free. Persons, dependents, slaves, all categories are legible to the law. Differences matter for outcomes, not for existence. The law does not question whether these beings belong to humanity. It calibrates how obligations apply to them. This calibration reveals an important priority. Law is concerned with continuity of order. It stabilizes expectations across time. For such stability to function, the human subject must be reliable. The law assumes that a person today is comparable to a person yesterday. Without this assumption, precedent would collapse. Legal language reinforces this comparability through formulaic repetition. Clauses recur across texts, sometimes copied verbatim, sometimes adjusted to local conditions. The repetition is not redundant. It is preservative. Each restatement confirms that the same kinds of humans continue to exist, capable of the same actions and subject to the same rules. Notably, legal texts often coexist with royal inscriptions that emphasize divine sanction. Kings present themselves as chosen by gods to establish justice, yet even the creation of humanity is not invoked. Divine authority legitimizes the lawgiver, not the human subject of the law. People are not said to become accountable because they were created. They are accountable because order requires it. The Anunnaki, when relevant, appear as guarantors of justice rather than as authors of humanity. They uphold decrees, oversee fate, or sanction punishment. Their role aligns with maintenance of order, not with defining who enters that order. The law does not need to explain humanity to function under their oversight. This silence becomes more apparent when contrasted with later theological reflection. Where mythological texts may ask why humans exist or what purpose they serve, legal texts ask only how they behave. The law is uninterested in origins. It operates in the present, projecting its authority forward through repetition. From a legal historical perspective, this suggests that humanity was treated as a constant across disruption. Even after catastrophe, even after shifts in kingship, the law resumes without redefining its subject. Obligations persist, penalties apply, contracts bind. The flood does not interrupt the logic of accountability. If humans had been newly created or fundamentally altered at some point, one might expect the law to mark that change. New capacities would require new rules. New kinds of beings would demand clarification. Instead, the law proceeds as though nothing about the human subject requires explanation. This procedural confidence reflects a deeper cultural assumption. Humanity is not an event to be narrated, but a condition to be managed. The law inherits this condition from the past and transmits it into the future. It preserves order by treating people as stable elements within it. The absence of an origin story in legal texts is therefore not an omission to be corrected. It is a structural feature. Law cannot pause to wonder where its subjects came from. Its authority depends on the assumption that they are already there, already capable of compliance or violation. This assumption reinforces a broader pattern. Administration counts humans. Architecture organizes them. Mathematics measures them. Law binds them. None of these domains require a moment of human creation to function. They require only continuity. As legal formulations accumulate and solidify, they deepen this continuity. Each case presumes the last. Each rule anticipates repetition. Humanity moves through the law unchanged in kind, even as circumstances shift. This leaves a restrained but persistent question. If law never needed to redefine the human subject, even after catastrophe and restoration, then when the texts elsewhere speak of humans being created, what kind of act were they describing, and why does that act leave no trace in the rules that govern human life? If law binds humans without asking how they came to be, ritual goes even further. It does not merely assume humanity. It organizes human presence within time itself. Temple liturgies, offering schedules, and cultic calendars regulate when people act, what they bring, and how they stand in relation to powers beyond them. Yet within this dense ritual machinery, there's no moment reserved for explaining where humans began. Ritual texts are among the most repetitive documents in the Mesopotamian archive. The same offerings recur daily, monthly, annually. Bread, beer, incense, animals. The quantities are specified, the order fixed. These texts presuppose a community capable of remembering procedures and transmitting them intact. Ritual is not exploratory. It is conservative by design. The language of these liturgies addresses humans as participants who already understand their role. Instructions are rarely framed as first-time guidance. They are reminders, confirmations, or renewals of practice. The ritual assumes prior knowledge, both on the part of the officiant and the community that supports the rite. Humanity is present as a stable audience and workforce, not as a subject of inquiry. Offering lists reinforce this stability. They enumerate what must be given and to whom, often without explanation. A god receives offerings because that is what has always been done. The human role is to supply, prepare, and present. The texts do not justify this obligation by recounting a creation event. Obligation exists independently of origin narrative. Even rites that mark transition, festivals, renewals, moments of calendrical change do not introduce humans as new beings. They reaffirm relationships rather than inaugurate them. The turning of the year, the reinstallation of cult statues, the purification of spaces all proceed as acts of maintenance. Humanity moves through these cycles unchanged, reaffirmed rather than redefined. This maintenance logic is particularly evident in rituals of appeasement or correction. When misfortune occurs, rituals aim to restore balance. They assume that humans have deviated from proper alignment and must be brought back. The underlying premise is that the correct state already exists. Ritual does not create humanity. It corrects humanity's position within an inherited order. Te Anunnaki, when invoked in ritual contexts, appear as recipients of coordination rather than as narrators of origin. They are addressed collectively, asked to witness, to judge, to accept. Their presence reinforces the seriousness of ritual obligation, but they do not explain why humans stand before them in the first place. The ritual assumes that standing is already justified. This is not a silence born of neglect. Ritual texts are deliberate in what they include and exclude. They focus on precision of action, not explanation of existence. The success of ritual depends on correct performance, not on correct belief about origins. As long as humans perform their roles properly, the system functions. Ritual time itself reinforces continuity. Cycles repeat. Days follow nights. Festivals return. Humans are embedded within this repetition as enduring participants. The texts do not mark a first ritual performed by newly created people. They record rituals as if they have always been underway, interrupted perhaps, but never begun. In this way, ritual mirrors administration and law. It regulates without narrating. It preserves memory without recounting origins. Humanity is treated as an enduring presence that must be aligned, fed, cleansed, and corrected, but never introduced. This treatment has implications for how creation narratives function elsewhere. If rituals that govern the most intimate relationship between humans and gods do not require an origin story, then such stories must serve a different purpose. They may explain why obligations exist, but not how humans came into being as ritual subjects. The cumulative effect of ritual repetition is to naturalize human participation. Over generations, the question of origin becomes irrelevant to practice. What matters is correct performance now. Humanity is defined by action, not by beginning. As ritual texts continue to regulate lives without ever narrating their start, they quietly reinforce a worldview in which humans are always already there. They enter the temple, bring offerings, recite words, and depart, leaving behind records of what was done, not why they exist. This leaves a final, restrained uncertainty. If rituals assume humans without explaining them, even in moments of renewal and correction, then when creation is spoken of elsewhere in the record, is it addressing the reality of human existence, or is it addressing something ritual could regulate but never name? A shift in meaning rather than a beginning in time. If ritual can regulate humanity without ever naming its beginning, then the pattern begins to look less like an isolated habit and more like a structural solution. At this point, the question widens not outward into speculation, but sideways into comparison. Without assuming contact or influence, one can ask whether other early civilizations faced the same problem and resolved it in similar ways. In several ancient record traditions, the earliest surviving texts do not explain how humans began. They explain how humans are managed. Administrative documents, legal formulas, and ritual calendars appear before or alongside origin narratives, not after them. The sequence is consistent. Systems of order are documented first. Explanations follow later, when needed. This pattern does not require diffusion to be meaningful. Independent societies, confronted with the task of governing large populations over time, develop similar textual priorities. Writing emerges to stabilize memory, not to satisfy curiosity. It records obligations, quantities, and procedures. Humanity appears as an assumed constant, because administration cannot function otherwise. In early Egypt, for example, monumental and bureaucratic records presuppose a workforce, a population capable of labor and ritual participation. The texts do not dwell on the creation of humans. They focus on maintaining cosmic and social balance. Origin stories exist, but they do not structure daily Humanity is present before explanation. In the Indus Valley, seals and standardized weights suggest a highly regulated economic system. Yet narrative texts explaining human origins are absent from the archaeological record. Whatever stories existed did not govern administration. The system functioned on the assumption of stable human participation, without textual insistence on beginnings. In early Chinese contexts, oracle bone inscriptions record divination, sacrifice, and royal concerns. They address ancestors and powers, but they do not recount the creation of humanity. Humans are already there, performing rites, asking questions, and receiving answers. Explanation is directed upward, not backward. These parallels do not suggest shared belief. They suggest shared constraint. When societies reach a scale that requires writing, they prioritize continuity. They must assume the persistence of the human subject in order to regulate it. To repeatedly redefine humanity would undermine the stability that writing is meant to preserve. What distinguishes the Mesopotamian case is not the presence of origin narratives, but the way those narratives coexist with an older, deeper administrative silence. The Anunnaki, the flood, and the language of creation emerge within a system that has long treated humanity as given. The narratives do not found the system. They interpret it. Comparative evidence suggests that this is not unusual. Origin stories often arise when systems need justification, especially after disruption. They provide meaning rather than mechanics. The mechanics are already in place, inherited and functioning. Humanity is already embedded within them. This perspective reframes the question of multiple creations. Rather than asking whether humans were physically created more than once, the comparative pattern invites a different inquiry. How many times does a society need to redefine humanity and language in order to preserve order? Each redefinition may appear as a creation, even if the human presence itself never resets. The absence of diffusion claims is important here. Similar solutions can emerge independently when societies face similar problems. Writing fixes memory. Administration requires stability. Narrative supplies, meaning when stability is threatened or questioned. The recurrence of this pattern across civilizations suggests that it responds to structural needs rather than to shared myth. In this light, the Sumerian record appears neither exceptional nor anomalous. It is particularly well preserved, allowing us to see the layering of silence and explanation more clearly. Humanity is present in the earliest layers, unnamed and unquestioned. Later layers speak of making, forming, and assigning, not because humans suddenly appeared, but because their role needed to be articulated anew. Comparative civilization studies thus do not dilute the Sumerian case. They sharpen it. They suggest that the tension between assumed humanity and narrated origin is a common feature of early complex societies. The question is not whether humans existed before they were created in stories, but why stories felt necessary at certain moments and not at others. As one looks back from this broader horizon, the Mesopotamian tablets regain their specificity. They participate in a widespread human solution to the problem of continuity after disruption. They preserve systems first, then explain them. This leaves a quiet but pressing question. If multiple civilizations independently developed records that assume humanity before explaining it, then when Sumerian texts speak of creation, are they addressing a universal human problem of meaning after continuity or marking a specific moment when the inherited order itself required redefinition once again? If comparison shows that explanation follows continuity rather than founding it, then collapse offers the most severe tests of that pattern. Collapse disrupts cities, authority, and memory. It fragments archives and interrupts routine. Yet, even the record remains consistent in what it does not do. It never recreates humanity. Transitional administrative tablets from periods of decline are among the most fragile documents we possess. They are fewer in number, uneven in quality, sometimes hastily produced. Their content reflects strain, shortages, reassigned labor, diminished outputs. What they do not reflect is uncertainty about the human subject itself. People continue to be counted, named, assigned, and compensated, even when institutions falter. These tablets emerge in moments when centralized power weakens or shifts. Cities los administrative centers contract. Yet writing does not disappear immediately. It adapts. Smaller archives appear. Local authorities record obligations with reduced scope but familiar structure. The system bends, but it does not abandon its assumptions. In these records, collapse is registered as imbalance, not erasure. Grain deliveries fall short. Labor pools shrink. Offerings are reduced. Each of these changes is quantified against an earlier norm. The very act of recording loss presumes a remembered standard. Humanity remains the variable measured against that standard, not the standard itself. Notably absent is any attempt to narrate a fresh beginning. There is no statement that people must be remade to suit new conditions. The texts do not describe humans as having failed in their nature or needing redesign. Collapse is attributed to external pressures, failed leadership, or divine displeasure, but not to a flaw in humanity's existence. This restraint reflects an important resilience principle. Systems survive collapse by preserving their most basic assumptions. In Mesopotamian administration, the most basic assumption is the persistence of the human subject. As long as people exist who can work, obey, and be recorded, the possibility of restoration remains open. Even when kingship fragments or disappears temporarily, administrative practice continues at lower levels. Local officials keep lists. Temples manage reduced estates. Households track obligations. These practices require humans who are already legible to the system. The records do not pause to redefine that legibility. Collapsed texts often show heightened concern with legitimacy and memory. Titles are carefully stated. Lineages are emphasized. Appeals to tradition increase. These gestures aim to stabilize authority, not humanity. The fear is not that people will cease to exist, but that order will cease to bind them. From a resilience perspective, this makes sense. Recreating humanity would be the most radical response to collapse. and the most it would undermine continuity at the moment when continuity is most needed. The records instead double down on assumption. Humans are treated as the enduring substrate upon which recovery can be built. The Anunnaki, when invoked during or after collapse, appear as arbiters of restoration rather than authors of replacement. They are asked to return favor, re-establish balance, or renew kingship. The language seeks continuity with an earlier order. Even divine intervention aims to restore, not to start over. This pattern holds across multiple episodes of decline, whether following flood layers, political fragmentation, or economic contraction. The response is consistent. Administration contracts, but it does not reset its definition of the human subject. The possibility of renewal depends on humans being fundamentally the same as before. The absence of recreation narratives during collapse suggests that creation language serves a different function. It does not respond to every disruption. It appears selectively, in contexts where meaning rather than survival is at stake. Collapse demands management. Creation demands interpretation. Transitional tablets thus reveal the limits of what the system was willing to reconsider. Cities can fall, dynasties can end, measures can be adjusted, but humanity remains outside the scope of revision. The records treat it as a constant too essential to be questioned, even when everything else is unstable. This constancy reframes the central inquiry once more. If collapse does not trigger a new creation of humans, then creation narratives are not emergency responses to failure. They must address something subtler, a need to redefine purpose rather than existence. As the archives thin and then thicken again with recovery, they carry forward the same assumptions about who counts as human and how that humanity functions within order. The silence persists through collapse, just as it did through continuity, which leaves a final, unavoidable uncertainty. If humanity is never recreated, even when civilization itself nearly disappears, then when the texts speak of humans being created, what threshold are they marking? And why does that threshold appear only when order is stable enough to reflect on itself? By the time the record reaches its final layers, the pattern has become difficult to ignore, not because it declares itself, but because it refuses to do so. After administration, architecture, mathematics, law, ritual, comparison, and collapse, the tablets remain consistent in one respect, above all others. They never say that humans were created twice. This absence is not casual. The Mesopotamian archive is expansive, repetitive, and often redundant. When something mattered institutionally, it was said again and again, across genres and centuries. Kingship is lowered again. Temples are rebuilt again. Cities are founded again. Measures are fixed again. Even disasters are rearticulated in new language as memory requires. The record does not avoid repetition. It relies on Italiano. And yet, no tablet records a second moment when humanity itself is made anew. There is no formula that mirrors the return of kingship. No boundary phrase divides humans before and after. No caliphate announces a renewal of the human category. The silence is systematic. From an epistemological perspective, this silence must be treated carefully. It cannot be turned into proof of what did not happen. Absence is not evidence in the same way presence is, but absence that persists across contexts, genres, and centuries begins to take on structure. It becomes pattering silence rather than accidental omission. The scribes were capable of recording radical change. They documented the end of dynasties, the transfer of power, the interruption of order. They named gods when gods needed naming. They revised language when categories shifted. If a second creation of humanity had been understood as an event comparable to these, the tablets had the means to record it. Instead, what the texts preserve is a series of redefinitions that stop short of recreating the human subject. Humans are reassigned, reclassified, They are restored to proper alignment, corrected through ritual, bound by law, measured by number, organized by architecture. Each of these acts reshapes humanity's place within order, without ever questioning humanity's existence. This suggests that the category of human functioned as a foundational constant within Mesopotamian thought. It was not immune to interpretation, but it was resistant to erasure. Even when creation language appears, it operates within this constraint. It speaks of making humans for work, but never of making them again because they were lost. The Anunnaki, throughout their textual career, align with this restraint. They decide, decree, assign, and restore. They sanction order. They do not erase humanity to begin again. Their authority operates within continuity, not against it. When they are said to have participated in creation, the act is framed as authorization rather than replacement. What the tablets never say, then, may be as important as what they do. They never describe a moment when humanity fails so completely that it must be reconstituted. They never portray humans as provisional beings, subject to redesign. Even the flood preserves a remnant rather than clearing the field. This restraint reveals something about how the scribes understood knowledge itself. Writing was not a space for speculative reconstruction. It was a technology of memory. It preserved what had to remain stable in order for society to function. The origin of humanity did not serve that function. Its regulation did. From this perspective, creation narratives appear not as historical reports, but as interpretive layers. They articulate purpose, not process. They explain why humans serve, not how they came to exist. They respond to questions of meaning that arise within stable systems, not to moments of existential rupture. The question of whether humans were created twice, then, becomes less a matter of events and more a matter of language. How many times did the record need to redescribe humanity in order to preserve order? How many times did it need to restate purpose without restating existence? The tablets allow for remaking without rebirth. They allow for restoration without recreation. They allow for reclassification without redefinition. What they do not allow is a clean narrative of starting over. Historical restraint demands that we stop where the record stops. It does not permit us to fill the silence with certainty, either affirmative or dismissive. The absence of a second creation narrative does not mean the idea was unthinkable. It means it was unnecessary to record. And that, perhaps, is the most significant limit the tablets impose. They show us a civilization deeply concerned with continuity, deeply skilled at preservation, and deeply uninterested in explaining what it treated as given. Humanity was one of those givens. If the Sumerian record speaks of creation at all, it does so obliquely, selectively, and never redundantly. It circles the question without closing it. It allows humans to be made meaningful more than once, but it does not allow them to be made again in the way kingship or cities can be. So the inquiry ends where the tablets leave us. Not with an answer, but with a boundary. If humans were never recorded as being created twice, yet were repeatedly redefined in language, law, and ritual, then what, precisely, did creation mean to those who wrote the tablets, and how many times could that meaning change without the record ever needing to say so at all?